I'll just line myself up with the camera a little better. There you go. Let's just put some notifications that we are live. Put that away. Alright, now just put this on Discord and then we'll get started. Okay, put that away. This away, okay. It's already like 3:06, so ho ho ho! Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Hello and welcome. Just adjust my hat a little bit. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol, Part 2. Because I did read this yesterday. I only read just a little bit less than half, well, roughly we'll say half of the book. Because the Ghost of Christmas Past is a little bit longer than the other two ghosts. And of course the prologue is a lot longer than the epilogue. So today we'll be reading the second half, starting with the Ghost of Christmas Present, or Chapter 3 / Stave 3. It's funny that it's called like Stave 3. And so that's where we're going to be reading from today. We're going to start from Stave 3, the second of the three spirits, aka the Ghost of Christmas Present. If you need a little bit of cashing up for, like, I don't know, a super old book, basically the story is about a guy named Ebenezer Scrooge, and you know, he's a very greedy and stingy man, and he's not a very nice guy. And so because of this, he's haunted by a bunch of spirits, hopefully in the way of changing his perspective on life and, you know, his view on the Christmas holiday. Because before, you know, he kind of has no regard for other people celebrating Christmas. And so these spirits are basically trying to convince him otherwise, right? And of course, before he meets the three ghosts, he's met by the ghost of a friend, of a former friend, if you can even call it that, his business partner, Jacob Marley. And then Marley warns him. And I did read through the Ghost of Christmas Past, which has the ghost show Scrooge 5 kind of points of his lifetime. Although the fifth one is kind of like not really him. It's about the girl he kind of left for his money, basically. And it shows that she actually has a nice life. And she's, you know, she's in pretty good condition. And then Scrooge kind of realizes that, like, oh, you know, like, I guess his past was a little bit rough. Because of, you know, it's kind of catching up to him that his greed is really taking away from him being able to live. Because he used to be a very different person, as the Ghost of Christmas Past showed him. But now we are moving on to the second ghost that he will meet, the second spirit. So I will be reading now, starting from Stave 3, the second of the three spirits. Now waking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, for a special purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and laying down again, established a sharp lookout all around the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything but pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as hardly as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, Scrooge was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1, and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. And all this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or would be at. And what was sometimes apprehensive, that he might be at the very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would have unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly, and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called to him by name, and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room, no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked like a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there. and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrifaction of a hearth. Sorry, I don't know why I read it that way. That dull petrifaction of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped up upon the floor to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12 cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state, upon this couch, there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up high to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping around the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man!" Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though its eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Now look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple deep green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. His garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face. Sparkling eyes, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded around its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was on it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You have never seen the likes of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. "Have never walked forth with the youngest members of my family," meaning, for I am very young, "my elder brothers born in these later years," pursued the spirit. I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I am afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1,800. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. And so did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night. And they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, and scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below. The splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times where the great streets branched off, and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. And there was nothing very cheerful in the climate or in the town. And yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another. Sorry. Scam number. You can tell it's a scam number because it doesn't have the local area codes. Sorry. Where was I? Oh, yes. I'm going to read that last part again. For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now then, exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far. That just totally threw off the mood, right? I'm just talking about this nice Christmas day, and then I get interrupted by a phone call from a clothing store. Anyway. Okay. I'm going to back up a bit. Better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily if it were right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The plotterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the streets in their apoplectic opulence. They were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurred at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were branches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks, that the people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shuffling ankles deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squab and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant blooded race appeared to know that there was something going on, and, to a fish, went gasping round and round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. The grocers, oh the grocers, nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1. But through those gaps such glimpses! It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest looker-on feel faint if subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress. But the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day, that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came rushing back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humor possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection, and for Christmas daws to peck as if they close. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces, and at the same time there emerged from stores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people carrying their dinners to the baker's shop. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkling incense on their dinners from this torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled with each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day. And so it was. God love it, and so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners, and the progress of their cooking, in the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. Is there a particular flavor in which you sprinkle from your torch? Asked Scrooge. "Huh, there is. My own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given, to a poor one most. But why a poor one most? Asked Scrooge. Because it needs it most. Or sorry, I need to do the voice a little bit. Because it needs it most. Spirit, said Scrooge after a moment's thought. I wonder, you of all the beings in the many worlds about us should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment. I, cried the spirit. You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day on which they could be said to dine at all, said Scrooge. Wouldn't you? I, cried the spirit. You seek to close these places on the seventh day, said Scrooge, and it comes to the same thing. I seek, exclaimed the spirit. Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family, said Scrooge. There are some upon this... Sorry, I did the wrong voice. This is the spirit talking. There are some upon this earth of yours, returned the spirit, who lay claims to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us as all our kin and kith, as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible, as they had been before, into the suburbs of town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. You know, because he's a spirit and all. And perhaps it was the pleasure of the good spirit to show off his power, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk, for there he went, and he took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door, the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-torn gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and made a goodly show for 6pence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, the second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork in the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars clearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes started bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. I just gotta read here and see who's actually talking so I don't screw up the voices. "And whatever has got into your precious father then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha wasn't as late last year, by a half-day hour." "Where's Martha, Mother?" said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, Mother!" cried the two young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha!" "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are!" said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "We'd a deal..." Oh man, all these girl voices. "We'd a deal to work to finish up last night," replied the girls, "and had a clear way this morning, Mother." "Well, never mind so long as you are come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless you!" "No, no, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive on the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why?" Oh no, I just realized I did Bob Cratchit and Mrs. Cratchit's voice too similar. "Why, where's Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming?" said Bob, with a sudden declension in high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. "Not upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-horse that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob of his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and to think the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was held upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. And while Bob turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded by some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Oh, such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates, and Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner of the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everyone, not forgetting themselves, and mounted guard upon their posts, cramming spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight rose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat at the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There was never such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness, were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the apple sauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't eat it all at last. They didn't eat it all at last. Sorry, you're reading like 19th century English, where certain grammar things we don't talk like this normally. So I know I'm gonna have like some hiccups here and there. Though they had not eaten it all, everyone had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it, while they were merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding. Like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half of half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedite with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, what a wonderful pudding!" Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. "Don't tell the kids that," Mrs. Cratchit saw that now the weight was off her mind. She would confess she had every doubt about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been heresy to have done so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last, the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done. And Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears! God bless us!" Which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side, upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Oh, sorry, I totally read that wrong. That's not Scrooge's voice. I gotta do it all over again. I gotta do the Ghost Christmas Presents voice all over again. "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. That's why I originally thought it was Scrooge's voice, because this is a line Scrooge did say earlier, but now the ghost is making fun of him. And so the ghost is making fun of Scrooge by saying something he would say, except, you think of it like, how's the old saying go, right? 1,000 deaths is a statistic, 1 death is a tragedy. And so, this once again kind of shows this kind of change of perspective in Scrooge's heart, right? That before he kind of didn't care if people lived or died, right? But now, when we're talking about one child, right? That statement Scrooge would normally just say casually has a completely different meaning. And Scrooge realizes this. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is, will you decide what men shall live and what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's kid. Good Lord, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on too much life among its hungry brothers in the dust. Scrooge bent down before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "Ha! Founder of the feast indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feed upon, and I'd hope he have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children! It's Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," she said, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy-heart, unfeeling man as Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake, and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him! A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year! You'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for 5 full minutes. After the time had passed, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collar, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday, she passed at home. Also, how she had seen Countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. At the time the chestnuts and the jug went round and round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There's a nice little picture here. I'm gonna show the picture first before I read the rest of this page, but it's a really nice picture. So it's the family. So you have, I'm trying to tell who's who actually. Okay, so this would naturally be Bob Cratchit, which I'm trying to do the Mickey Mouse voice for. This is Mrs. Cratchit. Then you have Peter. This is Master Peter. When they call him Master Peter, I think he's some kind of, I think he's like a distant relative, but it's not exactly clear. We just know he's also a Cratchit, but he's not like Bob's kid. Then we have Martha, and Martha is a closer relative. Like she's probably like a cousin to the other kids. Then you have Belinda, one of the oldest of the kids. Then you have the two, quote unquote, two young Cratchits right here. And of course, this kid sitting in this chair with his crutch is Tiny Tim, which, as the spirit mocks Scrooge of, will die. Because, I mean, who's going to help him, right? And, you know, even though there's a rich man like Scrooge who could, why would someone like Scrooge want to help him, right? That's kind of how the spirit taunts him, right? Taunts Scrooge. And so the spirit tells Scrooge that, like, yeah, this kid is going to die because what help can he get, right? He's never going to get better from his condition. And besides, someone like you wouldn't care anyway. Which is like really stinging words for Scrooge, right? But anyway, I'm going to keep reading now. There was nothing of high marks in this. They were not a handsome family, and they were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's, but they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time, and when they faded, they looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eyes upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in the kitchen parlors and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn, to shut out cold and darkness. Sorry, I'm trying to see if did they go somewhere else? Yeah. Yeah, they went somewhere else. So now they're at a different house. Sorry, see, I didn't quite keep track of that myself, so I understand if you couldn't either. So I'm confirming it for you now. They're now at a different house on Christmas Day. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling. And there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbor's house, where woo upon the single man who saw them enter. Oh, artful witches! Well, they knew it, in a glow. If you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high, blessings on it. How the ghost exulted. How it bared its breadth of breast and opened its capacious palm and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before, dotting the dust street with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the spirit passed. Though little kenned the lamplighter, little kenned the lamplighter, there you go, that he had any company but Christmas. And now, Without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were the burial places of giants, and water spread itself wherever it listed, or would have done so. But for the frost that held its prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze, and coarse rank grass. Down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation from an instant, like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth, dude," returned the spirit. "But they know me. See!" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced toward it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled around a glowing fire. An old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, so great-grandchildren, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge to hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped whither, not to see. To see? To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the water chafed and dashed. The wild year, though, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind, one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder, with his face all damaged and scarred up with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heavy sea, and the heaving sea, on and on, until being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures in their several stations. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. and every man on board, walking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than in any day of the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. Ominous! It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize that it was his own nephew's, and to find him in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the Spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. Oh crap, what voice did I give this guy? Ha ha, ha ha, laughed Scrooge's nephew. Ha ha ha! If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things that while there is an infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily, "Ha ha 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 ha! He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live!" cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it not." More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless those women. They never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest. She was pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimple, surprising-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin, so she had freckles, that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you have ever seen in any little creature's head. Although she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh ho ho, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said the nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I am sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least, you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he is ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience for him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters, I don't know why they did, whatever. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come to dine with us. What's the consequences? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges. They must have been allowed to have been competent judges, because they had all just had dinner, and with dessert upon the table, were clustered around the fire by lamplight. Ha! Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly gotten his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereas Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one, the niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do with the aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say, said the nephew, that the consequences of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him, if he finds me going there in good temper, year after year, and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something, and I think it shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured, and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment, and passed the bottle joyously. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family, and knew what they were about. When they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. So not like me, who sucks at singing and would die if I tried to sing, would die of embarrassment if I tried singing. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing, you might learn to whistle it in about 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands. I should roll the chair this way, so I'm more in line with the camera. Without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. Need to take a quick drink. But they did not devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There was first a game at Blindman's Buff. Of course there was. And I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas present knew it. The way he went after the plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage of the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping up against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains, wherever she went. There he went. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anyone else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, and stood there, you would have made a feint of endeavoring. Wow, I can't read today. Would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you. Which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. Sorry, I got so caught up in the moment I forgot how to read. Because it's actually kind of funny what's going on here, right? That, this Topper, I assume he's like a friend of Fred, the nephew. And he's like chasing around, one of Fred's in-laws. Let's go with that. One of his sister-in-laws. And he's just making an ass of himself the whole time, right? Like, he's just being an idiot the whole time as he's trying to get this girl's attention. As guys do, right? So it's a little funny when you picture it in your head. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really wasn't. But when at last... Oh, now you have to hear that water. Anyway, but when at last he caught her, when, in spite of all her silken rustlings and her rapid flusterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape. Then his conduct was the more execrable. That's how you would read it by syllable, but I don't think that's how it's actually pronounced. Execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further, to assure himself of her identity, by pressing a certain ring upon her finger, and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it. When another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind men's buff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the forfeits and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and where, she was really good, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge. For, wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears, he sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed right too, for the sharpest needle, Bess Whitechapel, warranted not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. Sorry if you couldn't quite catch that as this water runs in the background. Sorry that you have to deal with that, but there's a washroom actually above me, and so anytime that washroom is used, as you can hear, the water sound goes through this wall behind. Well, actually, you can't see it because I have. One reason I have this thing in the background is because you could actually see the pipe that actually runs down. You can actually see it like at the back wall over there, and the water, since the water is passing through there, that's why it's so loud. But if you didn't catch what was going on, basically they're playing like a kind of game, kind of like 20 questions basically, and Scrooge is actually really good at 20 questions, and he's kind of answering all the questions. But of course, Scrooge isn't really there, right? This is just the ghost of Christmas Present showing him this party. But just like Fred said earlier, it's to Scrooge's disadvantage. To not celebrate Christmas because, you could be having a grand old time, right? And Scrooge would be if he was able to play these games with the family, right? But of course, Scrooge, in his, stingy behavior, he's kind of ostracized himself. And now kind of like, as he wants to kind of get involved, but he can't, because that's kind of who he is. So that's kind of what was happening. That was kind of the scene I was reading out, but I know the water might have blocked out some words because this mic is very sensitive, so it will pick up like background noises. So like when people walk around in like the hallway next to me, you'll hear it. I'm sure you've noticed that in like all my other videos too. But anyway, I'm going to continue because I can't believe we're already like an hour and 20 minutes in and I'm still in the Ghost of Christmas Present. So we've got to get a move on. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this the spirit said could not be done. "Here is a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering their questions with yes or no. So basically now they're playing 20 questions. As the case was, the brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited him that he was thinking of an animal. A live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and it lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anyone, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, an ass, a cow, a bull, a tiger, a dog, a pig, it wasn't a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, I found it out. I know what it is, Fred. And I know what it is." Sorry, I'm not going to do a voice for her anymore. Because I realize I keep doing the same voice. It's like Bob Cratchit and Mrs. Cratchit. It's like my weird voice, but I can only do it for so many characters. Okay. "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge." Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had never had any tendency that way. He has given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure, said Fred. And it would be ungrateful not to drink, to not drink, sorry, and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is the glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly became so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in an unaudible speech, if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were once again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful on foreign lands, and they were close at home by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope by poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door, and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. Oh, it was a long night, if it were only a night. But Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time that they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's Twelfth Night party. When looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that his hair was gray. Are spirits' lives so short? Asked Scrooge. My life upon this globe is very brief, replied the ghost. It ends tonight. Tonight? Cried Scrooge. Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near. Because he still sounds like a dude. He still sounds like a surfer dude in his old age, you know. The chimes were ringing, and 11:15 at that moment. Forgive me, for I am not justified in what I ask, said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe. But I see something strange, and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw? It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it, was the spirit's sorrowful reply. Look here. From the foldings of its robe, it brought 2 children. Wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet, and clung upon the outside of its garment. Oh man, look here! Look! Down here! Exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out, and touched them with the freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them, and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, where devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of wonderful creation as monsters have so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them show to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves. Rather than be parties of a lie of such enormous magnitude. Spirit, are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are man's, said the spirit, looking down upon them, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, and this girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out its hand toward the city. Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your factious purpose, and make it worse, and bide the end. Have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. At last the stroke ceased to vibrate. He remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist among the ground towards him. Bam, bam, bam! Here's a cute little picture. I don't know how well you can see it. It's a pretty small picture. I'll put it as close to the camera as possible. It's a picture of Fred, his wife, and, you know, his guest, I guess, their guests, I guess you could say. They're, you know, having a grand old time together at Christmas. So, just to sum up, basically, what happened was, you know, the Ghost of Christmas Present was showing him all these people having a good time on Christmas Day, right? Because that's what Christmas Day is about, right? It's about, you know, accepting the gift, right? The gift of life, essentially. Which, I mean, the story does it in a clever way that, I mean, yeah, there's implications of, like, because, you know, this is, what, 19th century Europe, so there's still, like, the Christian influence. But the story is very clever that it doesn't have to be explicit about that. But it's basically saying that, like, hey, Christmas is about the gift of life. And since we are here and we live, right, you live it up, right? You have a good time with your family, your friends, right? Because that's the joys of people. That's the joys of life, right? And so the Ghost of Christmas Present was showing Scrooge all these different places where people were just doing exactly that. Of course, like the two major ones were Bob Cratchit, which is funny because in the book, Cratchit's name is not revealed till now, right? Of course, if you ever watch it like one of the Christmas Carol movies, then obviously Cratchit's name is known beforehand because, like, obviously Cratchit talks to, like, Fred, for example, and it's one of the funny things where, like, Fred is an interesting character, right? Because, you know, he tries to be a nice guy, but at the same time he kind of accepts that people talk shit about his uncle. Basically, they talk crap about Scrooge because Scrooge is pretty terrible, and Fred is inclined to agree, despite the fact that Fred tries to be a nice guy, right? And one of the things that's just kind of heartwarming is how, like, Fred actually feels bad for Cratchit, and Fred's like, man, if only, like, my uncle treated him better, right? Because Cratchit's, like, a pretty good guy. This shortbread is really good. I'm gonna eat this because it's been sitting here on this table for me. Just take a short break, and then I'm gonna read the chapter 4, which is when Scrooge is visited by the third spirit. Which you can already guess who this is, right? Because the other two spirits, we know who they are, right? The Ghost of Christmas Past and the Ghost of Christmas Present. So you can pretty much guess who the next ghost is going to be. I don't know why people think tonic is like that good. I mean, yeah, it kind of helps your throat a lot more, especially when it's cold out. But tonic generally tastes pretty bad. I like mix this tonic. That's what I'm drinking, by the way. I mix it with like a fruit juice, just because like, oh, it tastes better. Because yeah, like tonic tastes terrible. So I'm just looking at something on Discord right now. Just take a short break, rest my throat a sec. I'm gonna read the next chapter very soon. If you need to grab yourself, like, you know, a warm drink or whatever, you know, do that now. I'll just take like a minute or two. Because, I mean, reading that one chapter took me like an hour and a half almost. So I'll give you a minute. Okay. Since, you know, I want to finish this book before the stream ends at 6, because I might actually need to go all the way till 6. I know it takes so long to read like a... I thought I was going to get through this book way faster. Because it's not even that long, right? But anyway, here we go. Stave 4. The last of the three spirits. The phantom, slowly, gravely, silently, approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit never spoke, nor moved. Am I in the presence of the ghosts of Christmas yet to come? Said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed outward with its hand. You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in time before us? Scrooge pursued. Is that so, Spirit? The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. Basically, he nodded. That was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could not see but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. "Ghosts of the future?" Scrooge exclaimed. "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge. "Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, Spirit." There's actually a picture here, but I'm not going to show it until after I get to the page that the picture is depicting, if that makes sense. Because right now I'm on page 84. I'm on page 87 now. I was on 86, now I'm 87. But the page that the picture depicts is actually page 94. So I'm going to wait till I read that page and then I'll show you the picture. The phantom moved away as it had come towards him, and Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up. He thought and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city seemed rather to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were, in the heart of it, on 'change, almost among the merchants, who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches, and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "Oh, no," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it either. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another one. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" Sorry, this is the third guy. "So, what was the matter with him?" asked the third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff box. "I thought that guy would never die." "Oh, God knows," said the first with a yawn. "And what has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose. He's got like a hook nose kind of thing, that shook like the grills of a turkey cock. Or... Oh, this is the same. Okay, this is the fat guy again. Or Robert Hordes, said the man with the large chin, yawning again. Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know. This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. It's likely to be a very cheap funeral, said the same speaker. For upon my life, I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer. I don't mind going if a lunch is provided, observed the gentleman with the excrescence on his nose. But I must be fed if I make one. More laughs. Well, I'm the most disinterested among you, after all, said the first speaker. For I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch. But I'll offer to go, if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not all sure I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye. Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked toward the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into the street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie there. He knew these men also, perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had made a point always of standing well in their esteem, in a business sense, that is strictly in a business point of view. How are you? Said one. How are you? Returned the other. Well, said the first, Old Scratch has gotten his own at last. So I'm told, returned the second. Cold, isn't it? Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose. No, something else of it. Good morning. Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial. But feeling assured that they might have some hidden purpose, he set himself to reconsider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was the past, and this ghost's province was the future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them. But nothing doubting that to whomsoever they applied to, had some latent moral for his own improvement. So Scrooge resolved to treasure up every word he heard, and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared. For he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of these riddles easily. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that pulled in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out this way. Quiet and dark, beside him stood the phantom, with his outstretched hand. When he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of the hand, and its situation in reference to himself. that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunken, slip-slog, ugly. Alleys and archways like so many cesspools disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth, and with misery. Far in this den of infamous resort, there was a low-browed beetling shop below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were brought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse irons of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat, and sepulchres of bones. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in, by a charcoal stove made of old bricks, was a gray-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtaining of miscellaneous tatters, hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too. And she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into laugh. I need a voice for this guy. Or girl. I need to check who's doing voices here. Okay. Let the charwoman alone be the first, cried she who entered first. Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe. Here's a chance, if we haven't all three met here without meaning it. I need a voice for this guy, too. Well, you couldn't have met in a better place, said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. Come into the parlor. You were made free of it long ago, you know. And the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop, huh? How it shrieks. There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its own hinges, I believe. And I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. We're all suitable to our calling. We're all matched. Come into the parlor, come in. The parlor was the space between the screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again. And while he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees and looking with a bold defiance at the other two. I need to readjust my position here. What? Okay. What odds then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber, said the woman. Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did. That is true indeed, said the laundress. No man more so. Who's speaking? Okay, it's just the two women exchanging dialogue. Why, why then don't stand staring as if you was afraid, woman? Who's the wiser? We're not gonna pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose. No, indeed, said Mrs. Dilber and the man together. We should hope not. Very well then, cried the woman. That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose. No, indeed, said Mrs. Dilber, laughing. If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, a wicked old screw, pursued the woman. Why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he had had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out of his last there alone by himself. It's the truest word that was ever spoken, said Mrs. Dilber. It's a judgment on him. I wish it was a little heavier judgment, replied the woman. And it should have been. You may depend upon it, if I could have laid my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We knew pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe. But the gallantry of our friends would not allow this, and the man in faded black mounted the breach first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeves, buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally what? They were severally examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them in a total when he found that there was nothing more to come. That's your account, said Joe, and I wouldn't give another sixpence. If I was to be boiled for not doing it, who's next? Mrs. Dilber was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. I always give too much to the ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I'll ruin myself, said old Joe. That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off a half-crown. And now undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman. So Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. What do you call this? Said Joe. Bed curtains? Ah, returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms. Bed curtains. You don't mean to say you took him down, rings and all, with him lying there, said Joe. Yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not? You were born to make your fortune, said Joe, and you'll certainly do it. Oh, I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in it by reaching it out. For the sake of such a man as he was, I promise you, Joe. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now. His blankets? Whose else do you think? Replied the woman. He isn't likely to take cold without him, I dare say. I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh? Old Joe said, stopping in his work and looking up. Don't you be afraid of... Sorry. Don't you be afraid of that. I am so fond of his... Sorry. Who's talking here? There's actually quite a bit of dialogue, so I have to make sure I'm doing it right. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things, if he did. Ah, you may look like that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me. And what do you call wasting it? Said old Joe. Putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure, replied the woman with a laugh. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, if calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming to the body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one. Okay, so before I continue, I'm going to show you that picture now. So, when old Joe, he's looking at the bed curtains, he's like, what are these? Bed curtains? Okay, I want to make sure I show you that picture before I forget. Okay, continuing on. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, as they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp. He viewed them with a detestation and disgust, which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. Laughed the same woman when old Joe produced a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground. This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead. Spirit, said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot. I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this? He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed. And now he was almost touched. For now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which beneath a ragged sheet there laid something covered up, which though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced around it in obedience to a simple impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced toward the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do so, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thy command, for this is my dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honored head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and the pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous and true, the heart brave, warm and tender, and the pulse a man's. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound, to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked up upon the bed. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice, hard dealings, gripping cares, they have brought him to a rich end truly. But he lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, a woman, or a child to say he was kind to me in this or that. And for the memory of one kind word I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think. "Spirit," Scrooge said, "this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me. Let us go." Still, the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. "I understand you, and I would do it if I could. But I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power." Again, it seemed to look upon him. "If there was any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death," said Scrooge, quite agonized, "show that person to me, Spirit. I beseech you." The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children in their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed how to answer. Hang on, I'm just going to read something, so. Okay. I'm going to kind of give away what happens next because I'm going to do the voice acting for it as accurately as possible. But I know the story tries to keep it a little bit anonymous of who these people are, but because of the voices I'm gonna do for them, you're gonna kind of figure out what happened. But please, I hope you guys are in suspense because this part is supposed to be like very suspenseful, right? Because I mean, it is the ghost of Christmas future after all. Is it good? She said. Or bad? Bad, he answered. We are quite ruined. No. No. There's hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, she said, amazed. There is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He is past relenting, said her husband. He is dead. She was a mild and patient creature if her face spoke truth. But she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry. But the first was the emotion of her heart. What the half-drunken women... Sorry, wrong voice. What the half-drunken woman whom I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only openly ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time, we shall be ready with money, and even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts. Sorry. Wow, I totally did the voice wrong. Because I thought Caroline was still talking. To whom our debts will be transferred? I don't know. But before that time, we will be ready with the money. And even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes. Soften, as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood. It was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. Let me see some tenderness connected with death, said Scrooge, or that dark chamber spirit which we had left just now will be forever present to me. Okay, we're near the end of this part. Because the Ghost of Christmas Future part is actually kind of short. But it is a lot of voice acting for me, so it is like, The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet as they went along. Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and children seated around the fire. Quiet. Very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat up looking at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard these words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out, as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hands to her face. The color hurts my eyes, she said. The color. Ah, poor Tiny Tim. They're better now again, said Cratchit's wife. It makes him weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time. Past it, rather. Well, this is the first time this guy talks. Past it, rather, Peter answered, shutting up his book. But I think he has walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, Mother. Oh, so Peter is actually a son. He's not just a relative. They were quiet again. At last, she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once. I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulders, very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter, often. And so have I, exclaimed another, and so had all. But he was so very light to carry, she resumed, intent upon her work, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. And there is your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob and his comforter. He had need of it. Poor fellow came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees, and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, Don't mind it, father. Don't be grieved. Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table, and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today then, Robert? Said his wife. Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on Sunday. Why, my little child, cried Bob. My son! He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his children would have been further apart, perhaps, than they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again, quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and the mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. On which, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you've ever heard, I told him. I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that I don't know.
Knew what, my dear? Why, that you were a good wife, replied Bob. Everyone knows that, said Peter. Very well observed, my boy, cried Bob. I hope they do. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card. That's where I live. Pray come to me. Now it wasn't, cried Bob, for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim, and felt with us. I'm sure he's a good soul, cried Mrs. Cratchit. You would be sure of it, my dear, cried Bob. If you saw and spoke to him, I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation. Only hear that, Peter? Said Mrs. Cratchit. And then, cried one of the girls, Peter will be keeping company with someone, and setting up for himself. Get along with you, retorted Peter, grinning. I don't know why he gave him the most normal voice. It's just as likely as not, said Bob. One of these days, though, there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however, and whenever we part from one another, I am sure none of us will forget poor Tiny Tim, or this first parting that there was among us. Never, father, they all cried. And I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves, and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. No, never, father, they all cried again. I am very happy, said little Bob. I am very happy. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him. His daughters kissed him. The two young Cratchits kissed him. And Peter himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, the child's essence, was from God. Spectre, said Scrooge, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what that man, that was whom we saw laying dead. The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, though at a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these latter visions, save that they were in the future. Into the resorts of businessmen, but showed him not himself indeed. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on, as to the end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. This court, said Scrooge, through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in days to come. The spirit stopped, and the hand was pointed elsewhere. You can't see my finger. You still can't see it, but you get the idea. The house is yonder, Scrooge exclaimed. Why do you point away? The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same.
and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined it once again, wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look around before entering. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds. The growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up too much burying, fast with repleted appetite. A worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced it towards it trembling. Scrooge, advanced towards it trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been. But he dreaded that he saw new meaning in this solemn shape.
Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, said Scrooge, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be?
Still, the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood.
Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which it is preserved in. They must lead, said Scrooge.
I mean, Scrooge is the only one who talks here, so.
But if the courses have departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me.
The spirit remained unmoved. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave, "Here lies Ebenezer Scrooge."
Am I that man who laid upon the bed?
He cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him, and back again.
No, spirit. Oh, no, no, no.
The finger was still there.
Spirit,
he cried, tight clutching at its ropes.
Hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am all past hope?
For the first time the hand appeared to shake.
Good spirit,
Scrooge pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before.
Your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I may yet change. These shadows you have shown me but an altered life. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing of this stone.
In his agony, he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. And here's a little illustration of the ghost showing Scrooge his own grave. I don't think you can see that very well. I'm afraid the camera's quality is not that great. But, I mean, just got... You know what the tombstone says. It says, "Here lies Ebenezer Scrooge." And yes, I didn't... I mean, that's I'll kind of just sum up this chapter, right? So basically, I mean, you already know that like Scrooge is dead in the future, and so the people like he was basically grave robbed because I mean Scrooge had no will or whatever, right? Like he didn't have any care for anything, so people just like straight up ransack his house, broke in, stole his stuff, right? And then people were like having a laugh about it, right? Because Scrooge is dead. He doesn't need his stuff in the afterlife. Let's just steal it, right? I mean, it's not theft if the guy's dead, right? So, people just kind of gleeful that he's gone, right? And of course, there was Caroline and her husband, and then of course we meet the Cratchits, right? And then the Cratchits, they're kind of in a really bad place because of Tiny Tim is also dead in the future. And so in most versions of the funny thing is that like the Disney version actually has like the most liberties, because in the Disney version they actually see the Cratchits are actually at the cemetery, and they kind of like condense the scene, right? Because they didn't want to do two separate scenes of the Cratchits house and then the cemetery. But in the book, yeah, it's two separate scenes, right? Because it was Christmas Day, Cratchit went alone, or Bob went alone, to bury Tim, and then everyone else was at home, right? Because of course there are other like customs, right? Like not everybody goes to a funeral, kind of thing, and especially when it's a child, because it just brings so much pain, right? And I tried to do that. I tried to do that part justice. When the Cratchits, broke down, right? Because, I mean, that is the saddest thing of any Christmas, right? Is to lose a young loved one like that. And so, I tried my best there to do that scene justice. And then, of course, ironically, Scrooge's death, I kind of did that very anticlimactic. He falls on his bedpost, right? But, Scrooge, he wants to be different because he wants to avoid this darker fate, to be laughed at upon his death, right? Because Scrooge figures out that like, oh, all those people laughing at, the people happy that he's gone, right? People stealing his stuff in his death, right? And so Scrooge wants to move away from this horrible fate to be remembered as the most miserable person. Right? But now, Scrooge awakes in his bedpost. Stave 5, the end of it. Don't worry, this part's really short, and then we're going to end the stream after this. Stave 5, the end of it. Yes! And the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all. The time before him was his own, to make amends in. I will live in the past, the present, and the future, Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, oh Jacob, on my knees. He was so flustered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. They are not torn down, cried Scrooge, folding out his bed curtains in his arms. They are not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will. His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, laying them, parties to every kind of extravagance. I don't know what to do, cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath, and making a perfect laocoon of himself with his stockings. I am as light as a feather. I am as happy as an angel. I am as merry as a schoolboy. I am as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everyone.
A happy new year to all the world. Hallow here. Whoop. Hallow! He had frisked into the sitting room, and was now standing there, perfectly winded. There's the saucepan that the gruel was in, cried Scrooge, starting off again, and going round the fireplace. There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered. There's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. There's the window where I saw the wandering spirits. It's all right. It's all true. It all happened. Ha ha ha. Really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh. A most illustrious laugh. The father of a long line of brilliant laughs. I don't know what day of the month it is, said Scrooge. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hallo here. He was checked in his transports by the church's ringing out of the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clang, clang, hammer, ding dong, bell. Ding dong, hammer, clang, clash. Oh, glorious, glorious. Running to the windows, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial stirring. Cold, cold, piping for the blood to dance to. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious. What's today? Cried Scrooge, calling down to a boy in Sunday's clothes, who perhaps had loitered in to look about him. Eh? Returned the boy, with his mite of wonder. What's today, my fine fellow? Said Scrooge. Today? Replied the boy. Why, Christmas Day. It's Christmas Day, said Scrooge to himself. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello, returned the boy. Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner? Scrooge inquired. I should hope I did, replied the lad. Intelligent boy, said Scrooge. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little turkey, the big one. What? The one as big as me? Returned the boy. Oh, what a delightful boy, said Scrooge. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck. It's hanging there now, said the boy. It is? Go and buy it. Walker? Exclaimed the boy. No, no, said Scrooge. Sorry. No, no, said Scrooge. I am in earnest. Go and buy it, and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger who could have got a gunshot off so fast. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. He shan't know who sends it. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's, will he? The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did, somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As he stood there waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye. I shall love it as long as I live, cried Scrooge, patting it with his hands. I scarcely ever look at it before. What an honest expression it has in its face. It's a wonderful knocker. Here's the turkey. Woo, how are you? Merry Christmas.
I'll keep reading this page and then I'll show you the picture. It was a turkey. He could never have stood upon its legs, that bird. He would have snapped them short off in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax.
Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town, said Scrooge. You must have a cab. The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle in which he paid for the turkey, and chuckle for which he paid for the cab, and chuckle for which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again, and chuckled till he cried. Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much, and shaving requires attention, even when you don't dance while you are at it. But if he had cut the end of his nose off, he would have had a piece of sticking plaster over it and been quite satisfied. He dressed himself in all his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, and walking with his hands behind him. Scrooge regarded every one with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, sir." "A Merry Christmas to you." Oh, sorry, that's Scrooge's voice. "Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge often said afterwards that all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithiest in his ears. So, here's a picture of Scrooge walking through the town, super happy. He's celebrating Christmas like anyone else. Well, I mean more than anyone else, because he just splurged on like a prize turkey, paid for a cab probably the first time ever in his life, and like paid some random kid to run an errand for him. He probably spent more in this one day than he probably had in like a whole month. But here's Scrooge being super happy and celebrating Christmas. A changed man. Okay, where was I? Okay. Gotta get to the right page. My cat is here too, so it means it's almost time to end the stream because she's gonna be like, "Feed me!" Anyways, so Scrooge had not gone far when coming on towards him, he helped the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting house the day before, and said, "Scrooge and Marley, I believe?" It sent a pang across his heart to think of how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met. But he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it. "My dear sir," said Scrooge, quickening his pace, and taking the old gentleman by both his hands. "How do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir." "Mr. Scrooge?" "Yes," said Scrooge. "That is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness—" Here Scrooge whispered in his ear. "Lord bless me!" cried the gentleman, as if his breath were gone. "My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?" "If you please," said Scrooge, "not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that a favour?" My dear sir," said the other, shaking hands with him, "I don't know what to say to you so much
Munif. Don't say anything, please, retorted Scrooge. Come and see me. Will you come and see me? I will, cried the old gentleman, and it was clear he meant to do it. Thank ye, said Scrooge. I'm much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you. He went to church and walked about the streets and watched the people hurrying to and fro, and patted children on the head and questioned beggars and looked down into the kitchens of houses and up to the windows and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that anything could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he did make a dash, and he did. Is your master home, my dear? Said Scrooge to the girl. Nice girl. Very nice. What voice did I give her again? Oh. Yes, sir. Where is he, my love? Said Scrooge. He's in the dining room, sir. Oh, sorry. No, this is not his wife talking. This is another girl. He's in the dining room, sir, along with mistress. I'll show you up the stairs, if you please. Thank ye. He knows me, said Scrooge with his hand already on the dining room lock. I'll go in here, my dear. He turned it gently and slided his face in round the door. They were looking at the table, which was spread out in a great array, for these young housekeepers are always nervous on such points, and like to see that everything is right. Fred, said Scrooge. Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started. Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her sitting in the corner with the footstool, or he wouldn't have done it on any account. Why, bless my soul, cried Fred. Who's that? It is I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred? Let him in? It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did the plump sister when she came. And so did everyone when they came. Wonderful party. Wonderful games. Wonderful unanimity. Wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first, and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon. And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No, Bob. A quarter past. No, Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half beyond the time. Scrooge sat with the door wide open, that he might see him coming to the tank. His hat was off before he opened the door. His comforter, too. He was on the stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen, as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. Hello, growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. What do you mean? What do you mean by coming here at this time of day? I am very sorry, sir, said Bob. I am behind my time. You are? Repeated Scrooge. Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please. It's only once a year, pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank. It should not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir. Now I'll tell you what, my friend, said Scrooge. I'm not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, he continued, leaping from his stool, and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again. And therefore,
I'm about to raise your salary.
Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling to the people in the court for help from a straight waistcoat. Sorry, calling for help and a straight waistcoat. You know, the thing you kind of tie around crazy people?
A Merry Christmas, Bob, said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken, as he clapped him on the back. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, that I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family. We will discuss your affairs this very afternoon, over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. Make up the fires and buy another coat scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, Scrooge was like a second father. He became a good friend and a good master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good city knew, town or borough, in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset. And knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they would wrinkle up their eyes and grins, as well as have the milady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with the spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle, even afterwards, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possessed the knowledge, may that be truly said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one. And that is the end of A Christmas Carol. The story of one man's transformation to see the light and to celebrate Christmas and the blessing of life. Well, I hope you enjoyed that long read. I can't believe it took me essentially 5.5 hours to read a 100-page book, but I mean, there was quite a bit of text in it, and of course I had to do the voice acting too for some of the characters, though some of them I ended up butchering, but oh well, you can't be helped. I'm one guy doing all the voices of 20 characters. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Definitely pick up a copy and read it yourself, so you don't have to deal with my awful voice in the background. But it is a great Christmas story to read, and also to watch the movie adaptation. So I encourage you to do that in this Christmas season, even though we're stuck inside, because of the pandemic and all that. But that doesn't mean we can't celebrate the Christmas season and the joy of celebrating the gift of life. And so God bless us, everyone. This is going to be the end of the stream. I will see you guys probably tomorrow. I'll probably stream, probably just play whatever, start with some Mario 35 and maybe do other stuff. Who knows? But I'll see you guys tomorrow stream. And I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Merry Christmas, and God bless you.